есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город, в цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
I want to thank the organizers that I have this opportunity to present my work to the audience. And I am not used to speeches in English, so I'm going mostly to read from the paper, and I apologize for this. My study is about two Georgian women, two Georgian feminists who were active in the 1910s. And I would not say that my study is about the Russian Revolution, but the research is constructed around it. And I studied the activities of these women. Their names are Kato Mikhaladze and Nino Dreselashvili. And I know that these names are quite difficult to pronounce for foreigners, so I decided to call them simply Kato and Nino. The questions I tried to answer in this research are the following. How did these Georgian feminists try to realize themselves as political subjects? And how did their efforts play out in their contemporary political context? And what was the development of their faith and what became of their identities after the Russian Revolution? So I will try to answer these questions. And for this research, I used interdisciplinary methodology, which I don't have time to talk about in length, but if anyone is interested, I can send a full paper later. And I will tell you briefly that this is a combination of approaches and methods, like the theoretical meaning of gender is a category of historical analysis. The approach of dual systems theory, the method of qualitative content analysis, the theory and the method of archive work. And I am also going to briefly tell you about the Georgian context of this period, like the pre-revolutionary period. You probably know that Georgia was a part of the Russian Empire. In 1905, 1907, Georgian society became actively involved in the Russian revolutionary movement. And various stratas of society were involved, like workers, teachers, and students. And also the society, the public was dominated by the left-wing parties such as the Social Democrats, Socialist Federalists, and other parties. Then, when the February Revolution happened in 1917, this created the need of autonomous governance in Georgia. And when the October Revolution happened, it was denounced by the political parties of the South Caucasus, and these countries decided to continue their independent governance. So the independence of Georgia was declared on 26th of May in 1918. And Georgia continued to be an independent country until February 1921, while it was occupied, while it was invaded and occupied by the Soviet army. And then the Sovietization of Georgia has started. what I want to say is that in general this period was dominated by this revolutionary activists and antagonists between revolutionary and reactionary actors. So we have to see these political activities of Georgian women, Georgian feminists in this broader context. And now I will tell you what these women actually did. I will tell you about their activities and ideas. Both of these women, Kato and Nino, studied abroad. Kato studied in Moscow and later in Europe, and Nino studied in Moscow as well. And when they returned in Georgia, they became active in public life and started political activities. Kato established women's club in 1916 in the town of Kutaisi, and in February 1917, she also founded and published the first Georgian newspaper called Voice of Georgian Woman. And it was edited by Kato Mikaladze herself. This newspaper had, overall this newspaper had 50 issues in the years 1917-1918. Nino, on the other hand, became active earlier, since 1905, when the freedom of association has been declared in the Russian Empire. And she was involved in this successful endeavor, such as the establishment of the Caucasian Women's Society. This is CWS, and it was established in 1909. The CWS was demanding political rights for women. Also, it was interested by fighting prostitution, and also it opened women's club in Tbilisi and the cooperative dining. Kato, on the other hand, used this newspaper, Voice of Georgian Woman, to disseminate her ideas. And she hoped that the February Revolution would bring opportunities for women's liberation. And she addressed Georgian women and urged them to fight for their rights. I can read you the quote. The rule of violence has ended. Today, when the new kind of state is being founded, at this great historic moment, we are obliged to demand such conditions of political life that will enable future generations to freely develop their personalities. And for turning women into political subjects, Kato had the following strategy, that it was necessary for women to unite in solidarity regardless of their class and regardless of their party affiliation. And so she urged both bourgeois and proletarian women. She used this wording. She urged them to unite against patriarchy. And she wanted women to unite in local networks and to establish women's clubs, and then these networks and club would create a national organization of women. This was her idea of organizing. And she was influenced by then popular women's suffrage movement, and so, in her opinion, women had to demand civil and political rights, and had to fight for passive and active voting rights, and for women's political participation. However, both Cato and Nino had to act in the context of patriarchal barriers. And they are very critical of their contemporary male colleagues, so to speak. And this is evident in their texts. For example, Cato criticizes the Georgian Mensheviks for sex egoisms. And this was expressed in two ways. Restriction of women's political participation and resistance to women's independent organizations. And Cato also has a piece in these newspapers, one of these newspapers, called We and the National Assembly. And there she speaks about the first National Assembly in Georgia, which was held in November 1917. And she tells us that she was the only woman who put herself in the list of guest speakers, but she was not allowed to speak, and she tells us about her disappointment. And these complaints tell us that these women who were feminists had other expectations from the revolution. They expected that women, they expected more opportunities for women's liberation and emancipation, but they were disappointed. And now I will tell you what happened to them in the 1920s. That is, after the Sovietization of Georgia. It is quite interesting that the identities and activities suddenly changed, and instead of political activists, they became writers and poetesses. For example, in the later biography, Cato is remembered as a writer and poetess, and Nino's biography also mentions her as a writer and figure of Georgian national culture. And their political activities and feminist ideas were forgotten and became secondary for the historians. So why did this happen? I have already mentioned that Georgian male political figures ignored or devalued this women's labor and tried to hinder the activities. However, I think that the disappearance of these Georgian feminists as political subjects is the logical ending of the Bolsheviks' undemocratic policies. The Communist Party was always hostile to citizens' independent initiatives and especially to women's initiatives. And we know that the party began implementing its policies of women's emancipation from 1918, and this Zenotdel was founded. This Zenotdel is women's department of the Communist Party. However, these emancipation policies were enacted in an authoritative manner from top to down. And the lines set by the party did not include the goal of realizing women as political subjects. And often it ignored the interests and the needs of the real women. And later, in 1930, Stalin abolished even the Zenotdel. And from this period, the state policy of women's emancipation was connected to women's waged work. However, together with this waged work, women had also to be housewives and mothers, and motherhood and domestic work was once again declared as women's prime obligation. So I think that this double role of women, this policy is reflected in the fate of these Georgian feminists. I told you that they became writers, and on the one hand, writing is productive activity and public activity, but on the other hand, they were political activists and they were political figures, and their transformation into writers meant that they were removed from the public space, public sphere. And this writing here seems to be in agreement with Stalin's policy and how he determined the sphere of women's activities. And I think this is the explanation why these women as political subjects were neuralized and marginalized, and we knew later about them only as writers or poetesses. I will finish here. Thank you very much.